Good morning and welcome. The microphone is not because I can't be heard, as you know. It's really, we are streaming, and in order for the recording to work, the microphone needs to work. So I'll be asking the rabbis to pass the microphone back and forth in order to be heard. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to my supporters committee people, Craig and Linda, for being here and helping me with the beginning of our adult education program for this year, and very delighted to have Rabbis Moser and Fine here to begin the process. We'll go back to the Fireside Chat idea and to get to discuss. But I wanted to say, for me, to start, that there's a tension in the air, a tension I haven't felt in years. I'm as old as the state of Israel, so I remember the tensions from prior conflicts. I remember the tension about being a Jew and being on the world stage and feeling the minimalization of who I was in contrast to the world around me. And it's a very different world today. And in some respects, which kind of makes sense with our program today, we read about, over our millennia, times of pogroms and persecution and times that we were exiled and so on and so forth. And we look at them through the lens of history. It's tough to look at them through today's front page, to recognize we're back into a situation where Jews are on the stage and they're going to deal with an enemy, and then the world around them, again, looks at the Jews through a different lens, not one that I think I like. But today we get to talk about the Siddur, or the prayers that we use through the different theologies. And our prayers are probably a reflection, not probably, are a reflection of our history. In times of giving thanks and appreciation and the joy of celebration of life, and also the appreciation of loss. And life and loss come not just through the natural elements, but through the chaos that becomes the struggle. And we're still here today, thank God. But it continues to be that struggle. And I thought we'd moved on. I remember a quote that when Israel was fighting in Lebanon, and they were saying the Israelis were upset they had to go to military service because they were fighting about Wall Street, and in Lebanon they were still figuring out where was Main Street. And we're back into civilizations all around us in different stages of life and different purpose and how they clash. And as a result, what happens? And that tension for me is I still don't know what's going to happen. And probably you the same. As Israel is militarized, marshaled on the border, what will happen next? And why have they waited so long? What is going on behind the scene? What will come? And if they do step foot across the border, will the other borders collapse? And there's 2 aircraft carriers sitting in the Mediterranean, and the tension goes on. But we take a step back into what has been, and maybe we'll talk a little more about what prayer and how they differ through the eyes of the Reconstructionist movement and the conservative movement, and you all will be a part of those conversations as well. So I thank you for being here. I also hope and encourage that you'll come next week, same time, same place, when the rabbi will reprise his view of the texts from the Vatican in his summer special program. And he certainly can tell you about the texts from antiquity that were saved or put together by the church, and this compilation and how they looked at them after hundreds of years, thousands of years, and that'll be very exciting today. So I'll begin. I'll give the microphone to Rabbi Fine and say, let's begin our conversation.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. And yes, these are difficult times where there's stuff hanging in the air. And just so in case I forget later, I want to remind you we have more room if you didn't RSVP to the movie that we're showing Wednesday evening. And it's on the Yom Kippur War, which was a similar moment, right, of fear, and just 50 years ago. And we thought that the veteran of the Yom Kippur War who was going to speak to us after the movie, when hostilities began and Hamas attacked, he said, "There's no way I can do this." And then he just said he'll do it. Just found out yesterday. So he recommitted after saying, didn't think he could do it. So very happy to share that. So that should be a very special evening, Wednesday evening. We're starting at 7:30 at the Ridgewood Movie Theater. So as Bob said, prayer, which we were talking about, liturgy and prayer is that instinct to respond to our deepest concerns. And Jewish prayer is complicated because it's scripted. Right? It's scripted in that there are our concerns of a group, our concerns of a people, not only horizontally to other Jews, but also vertically to other times of history. And part of the tension in modern liturgy is what we do with the inheritance that we received of the traditional prayers, and do we offer those prayers? Do we make slight changes to represent, to reflect where we are, if we are in a different place than where people were for whom those prayers meant more at different times? And that's the tension that I think that we're going to address today.
Thank you, Rabbi Fine. As has been mentioned, what we're going to be talking about today are the ways in which liturgy changes, and the ways in which two movements in particular, the conservative and the Reconstructionist movement, have changed the liturgy from what we're going to be calling the traditional liturgy, right, or the historical rabbinic liturgy, to what they are in the modern prayer books, in our movement's modern prayer books. So before launching into a particular case on the Reconstructionist side, I think I want to just start very briefly with doing some framing, right? And the framing that I want to do is I want to suggest three main reasons or perspectives from which it might appear desirable to change liturgy, right? Because I think the why of changing liturgy is maybe more important even than the what, right? Much more important than the question of what are the differences between the various prayer books is the question about why those things are different in the different prayer books. So here are three main reasons that I'm going to maybe put forward as reasons why the liturgy might be changed by a movement. One of those reasons has to do with truth claims, right? When we pray, part of what we are praying involves either implied or directly stated claims about the truth, right? Whether theological truths about God or practical truths about the world in which we live, right? And sometimes we find that we no longer believe the factual assertions that are claimed or implied by a prayer to be true. And in that case, a movement might decide that it makes sense to change the text of a prayer. Another example, right, is the case of values, right? So sometimes it may not be a problem with the factual claims of the truth assertions of a prayer that we have a problem with, but rather the values or the morality of the prayer, right? Sometimes we reject some aspect of the prayer text on moral or ethical grounds. And then finally, there's consideration, which is what I'm going to call superfluity, right? Jewish prayer came into existence over a period of, hundreds and thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds and then thousands of years, through a process of accretion, right? With new prayers being added onto the layers of prayers that had already been established. One might say rather flippantly that over the centuries, the rabbis never encountered a prayer that they didn't like, and there was no prayer that was so optional that the Jews of subsequent generations would not then decide to make it more or less obligatory, to the extent that there has arisen in more modern times something of a backlash to that process. And we sometimes might find it desirable to change the prayer structure or to edit it to get rid of unnecessary length or repetition that might tax the energy and patience of the congregation, maybe driving down synagogue attendance, right? That's at least an argument that sometimes has been made when it comes to editing the prayer service. I'm not claiming that this list is exhaustive, but I think that it's helpful to think about what are some of the main reasons behind why prayers might be changed, and also to think about the ways in which all three of these different considerations may come into play on different sides of the debate when it comes to the question of whether to change the prayers or not, right? Making prayer books is always a messy affair, and it always involves a certain amount of debate and back and forth, right? There's always in any movement a more change-averse group and a more change-embracing group, and it's always a matter of compromise between the sides. No matter whether you're talking about, no matter what the general ideology of a particular movement may happen to be. Okay, so all of this is to frame what I'm going to begin by talking about, which is what generally strikes people as the most significant change in the Reconstructionist prayer book. I think it's also fairly characteristic in that, unlike other liturgical changes, this isn't a change that we share with any of the other major progressive Jewish movements. And I'm talking about the elimination in our prayer book of all references to Jewish chosenness. Right? The historic rabbinic liturgy makes numerous references to the idea of God having chosen the Jewish people. It's an idea that's based not simply on rabbinic ideas, but further back into Torah and other places in Scripture in which assert more or less the following. That God has singled Israel out for special love and attention, not granted to other peoples. That special love is ancestral, that it's based, at least in part, on the special relationship that existed between God and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that the most significant manifestation of that love is to be seen as the granting of the Torah, which is regarded as the unique revelation of God's will vouchsafed to the Jewish people alone. In liturgy, one of the most recognizable examples of chosenness in action can be found in the Torah service, right? The Torah blessing that we read every Saturday when we're about to read the Torah. The opening blessing goes, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato Baruch atah Adonai notein haTorah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has chosen us from among the peoples and given us the Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives you the Torah. So, not the only example. There's numerous examples of Bachar Banus and similar language which occur throughout the Siddur. So, this text has been changed in the Reconstructionist Siddur for the following reason. Mordechai Kaplan, as well as Ira Eisenstein and other early Reconstructionist rabbis, rejected the idea of chosenness as such, on both theological and ethical grounds, right? So this is one of those changes that covers, from a Reconstructionist perspective, both a challenge when it comes to the truth claims of the prayer and when it comes to the ethics of the prayer. When it came to the truth claims of the prayer, early Reconstructionist theology tended to focus on rejecting a supernatural conception of God as being inconsistent with the understanding of most contemporary educated Western Jews, and instead embraced a kind of naturalist theology that focused on the divine as something which manifests internally to phenomena in the world. That God is a power in the universe that makes for salvation. Such a conception of God is not a personal God. And so Kaplan and the others felt that the strong implication of the idea of chosenness, that God has particular desires and preferences for particular groups of people, is inconsistent and rationally insupportable with the theology of most Jews of their time. At least most Jews that were operating within, educated American society of their time. But on top of that, right, we've also got the ethical argument, which in some respects is more significant. Because ethically, the idea implies, or as in a great many rabbinical formulations, boldly states, that Jews are somehow superior to members of other peoples, which is an idea that Kaplan held to be morally repugnant. I'm going to share with you just, this is from The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. It's one of Kaplan's later works. It was written in the 1960s. But it generally, I think, encapsulates the general kind of gist about how Kaplan and some of his fellow early Reconstructionist rabbis tended to relate to this issue. He begins by speaking about the truth claims of the prayer, talking about how it's inconsistent with the conception of God that he's laying out in The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, and the way in which he thinks is more consistent with what most Jews in his time actually believe about God. But then he goes on. We cannot fail to recognize in the claim of Jewish superiority a kinship and resemblance to the similar claims of other national and racial groups which have been advanced to justify oppression and exploitation. Such claims have been used in defense of the imperialistic exploitation of the, and I'm sorry here, I'm going to use some outdated racial terminology because this was written in the 1960s. The imperialistic exploitation of the yellow and black races by the whites on the ground that they were, quote, the white men's burden, unquote. They are the ground for the German persecution of Jewry, in accord with the Aryan clause of the Third Reich's fundamental law. They were, in the past, the grounds on which our own people rationalized their conquest and expropriation of the Canaanites. The highest ethical thought of our day views all such claims to superiority of one race, nation, or caste as detrimental to the interests of humanity and hence as essentially vicious. So that's the ethical argument, at least, that's being presented by Kaplan and generally was agreed with by the majority of the early Reconstructionist rabbis. So consequently, the Reconstructionist prayer books have altered the liturgy to edit out references to Jewish chosenness. So as an example, I mentioned the Torah blessing, the traditional Torah blessing, which I read to you a moment ago. The blessing in the Reconstructionist prayer book, bless you, is a little bit different. So our version goes like this. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kervanu la'avodato, Venatan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So once again, blessed are you, Adonai our God, the sovereign of all worlds, who has drawn us to your service and given us your Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives us the Torah. Right? Maintains a conception. It maintains an idea that God is in some way involved in our engagement with Torah, right? That the Torah, that our being drawn to Torah is a manifestation of godliness, without reference to Torah and Israel being absolutely unique in being manifestations of God's will or presence in the world. So the one thing that I want to sort of add to this further is to point out that I mentioned before that two different considerations went into this particular aspect of change, right? There's the factual issue with the prayer and the ethical issue with the prayer. The reason why this is significant in the case of the Bacharbanus, the elimination thereof, is because later generations of Reconstructionists have actually differed somewhat in some cases with the early Reconstructionist approaches to the prayer, right? Namely, in the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, it started being argued by at least some Reconstructionist rabbis that trying to uphold a standard of absolute factual, literal truth in the prayer is not necessarily a desirable goal. Because in practice, it would, to make the prayers completely consistent with our literal understanding of the truth, would essentially mean eliminating the Jewish quality of the prayers entirely, right? They argued, on the other side, that actually most people, when they pray, are not interpreting the words literally and interpret the prayers in a poetic or metaphorical kind of mode. And that sometimes, in fact, especially if you don't believe in the literal existence of a personal God, that it's precisely even more important in those cases to adhere to the historical form of the prayers, because it connects us with the history of the Jewish people, right? And that in and of itself is of significant importance for Jews that don't necessarily understand God in supernatural or personal terms. What's significant about this is that in most of those cases, those rabbis of the sort of next generation of the Reconstructionist movement who were arguing for some kind of return to traditional language in prayer nevertheless maintained certain aspects of the changes in the prayers that had already happened on the ethical grounds. I'm thinking in particular here of Arthur Green, who was a rabbi and served as president of the RRC for a good long while. In the latter half of the 20th century, he argued for more traditional liturgical language on the basis that, prayer language tends to be interpreted poetically in any case. But he also, nevertheless, upheld Reconstructionist changes to passages referring to chosenness, stating that he believes that traditional formulations on chosenness are ultimately responsible for some of the Jews' attitude of superiority to non-Jews, and he said also some of the Israeli attitude toward Arabs. So all of this is to show how these different considerations, right, truth considerations, ethical considerations, can all play into the question of whether and how to change the liturgy, and that, in fact, multiple groups can be arguing for the same change, but on different grounds. I think I'll leave it there and pass it over to Rabbi Fein.
So the Bachar Banu, right, which is in the Aliyah, we sometimes hear the difference when Reconstructionists, when we especially have a combined service, and our CBI people more than welcome to use the Reconstructionist liturgy when they make the Aliyah. The difference is also in the Kiddush. You see the phrase there. There are a few other places like Havdalah and otherwise where it comes, mostly in the Kiddush and the Aliyah to the Torah. So the question is why the conservative liturgy retains the traditional wording of Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim, who chose us from among all the other peoples. And so the question then is why is that change? We picked 2 or 3 things we're going to focus on where there's a change in conservative liturgy, in Reconstructionist liturgy. We didn't say there was a change in conservative liturgy, and then we'll see this example. So just in terms of why it wasn't changed, I don't think that when Mordechai Kaplan put this change into the Reconstructionist prayer book, the first version came out in the 1940s, that you had the other half of the conservative movement that said, no, we are better than everyone else. No one said that, or at least they didn't say it out loud, right? It was more a sense of how do we understand what it means that God has chosen us. And our prayer book, the Lev Shalem, gives us, that approach is a very literal translation, because it wants to just give us the text, and what it says. There have been other attempts to explain it, that we have a special relationship with God, a unique inheritance of the Torah. And the way that I've generally understood it is that because conservative Judaism understands Judaism to be the result of the historical journey of the Jewish people, right? And the growth of Jewish culture and the understanding of God through history, right? There is so understanding it that way, that especially in terms of the Torah, right? Because the context here, if we talk about the Torah blessings, right, is the giving of the Torah, that the Torah is a unique inheritance of the Jewish people. And whether we understand the Torah as given to us by God, which is really a theological statement, or we understand the Torah to be the product of an historical development up to the point that it was redacted, which is an historical statement. In either case, it is the unique property of the central document of Judaism, of the Jewish people. And we understand the Torah, the item, right, that is covenanted between us and God, right? That the stuff of the covenant is the Torah and our fidelity to the Torah. So part of being chosen means that we are connected through this thing, and this thing is unique between us. So it's as if, for example, you think about a covenant as a marriage, right? A union between two people. Not that God's a person, but that's a metaphor for understanding it. So you have a wedding, a marriage, then you have a document. It could be a ketubah, could be a wedding ring. There's something of substance, right? And that is unique, right, between these two people, because that is what's, so the way that I've always understood chosenness, the sense that we understand that we are in a special covenanted relationship with God, and that the terms of our relationship are unique and are special, and they are special between us and God, and they are not shared with other people, with other peoples, right, in the world, even though, of course, the Bible is shared, right, with other religions. But from our perspective, right, the Torah, the Chumash, is unique to Jewish tradition. My take always on the idea of chosenness is that chosenness reflects our relationship with God. It doesn't necessarily imply that God cannot have other relationships with other peoples. So in Jewish law, there's this inequity where there's a non-egalitarian inequity in Jewish law, where a man can have more than one wife, but a woman can only have one husband. We generally don't like that. In this case, it works, right? In that we, right, can be married to God, and we have to live with the fact that God can also have relationships with other peoples, but our relationship is just with God. And again, the metaphor only works so far, but that's how we understand it. And that's why there's that famous Haftorah from Amos when God says, you think you're so special, I've also the God of Ethiopia, and there's the sense that when you believe that God is one God, if you really believe in monotheism, then how can God not have relationships with other peoples? That's also there in the book of Jonah, right? It's what drives Jonah up the wall. When Jonah says, what's the point of me prophesying to Nineveh? Because they're just going to repent and then you're going to forgive them. Now, God's relationship with the Ninevites has nothing to do with Jonah. That's what Jonah says. It's nothing to do with me, right? But yet God can also forgive the Ninevites, right? God can be everybody's God and is not unique to us, whereas the more ancient perspective is that everyone had their own personal, every city had its own God, that gods were localized. And if we really believe in monotheism, then we have to share. And it means God's relationship with other peoples, but it doesn't mean that my relationship with God is not special, right? So maybe that's a stretch. And you do have to do that, right? When you take something that's problematic in the liturgy and you want to get to the point where you're comfortable with it, as opposed to changing it, then it does imply you do have to do some stretching, right? You do have to come to a way where you're comfortable with it. Another thing I want to say, though, about the conservative position on chosenness is that when conservative Judaism began, it was basically the reason why it's called conservative is it's a response to reform. And the Reform Jews are, in a sense, of all the modern movements, so Orthodoxy is a different category, but of all the modern movements, Reform is the one that's most concerned with the idea of chosenness, because part of the main principles of classical Reform ideology is that the Jewish people have a special mission, and they have a mission to spread ethical monotheism throughout the world. So there is the sense of a very unique mission of the Jewish people. And this is one of the things that informs the emphasis on tikkun olam and social action. That is not that Jews that are not Reformed don't care about these things, but in Reform Judaism, it's at the top of the list. And the reason why it's the top of the list, because there's that sense that Reform Jews have a mission to go out into the whole world and change the entire world. And that mission is the idea of chosenness, right? That there is a chosen mission, that the Jewish people were elected by God. They got the prophets in order to spread ethical monotheism throughout the world. So they stress chosenness the most. In conservative Judaism, that stress dissipates a bit. And there's more focus not on being chosen vis-a-vis other peoples, but just being chosen to observe Torah and mitzvot. And that more traditional perspective of chosenness has a little less, it's not put in the context of other peoples, even though it says, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim, who chose us from the other peoples. The focus, the way we mark our chosenness, is simply by doing our role in the covenant, which is a statement of our relationship with God in theological terms. In historical terms, it's the way in which we preserve the cultures to connect, identify with our history, with the experience of our people through history. And that's an internal process, and it's not identified by how we think about people on the outside. It's I feel chosen because of what I do. So that's, I think, the way that we would generally perceive that, and why I'm comfortable with the traditional language there. We'll take a comment, then we'll go to the next. Yeah, go ahead, Judy.
The only problem that I have with that is that it's not a problem with chosenness, it's that we're chosen amongst from all the other nations of the world. It's that extra part that
Right, which I get, because it says it's not, we are chosen from all the other nations of the world. No, I understand. So it seems to be exclusive, depends on how you, right, so, and I understand that, right? I understand that. The way I read it is, I am chosen through connection with the Torah to all the other peoples in the other world, because no other people in the world has halakha, the way my halakha. No other people in the world has Judaism. So that's distinct. That makes Judaism distinct, right? Because it's different from all the other peoples in the world.
and I think that the Reconstructionists, when they take out the chosenness, they use the word Torah. They
Yeah.
substitute that. So
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
the importance to the Reconstruction is that God has given us the Torah.
Yeah.
But taking out the words from, from all the other nations of the world, and I guess like when you were using, for me it could be an example of where men can marry more than one woman. Let's say, I'm just saying, we don't have this in Judaism, but the idea of a harem, and guy has, many wives. What happens is that he chooses his favorites, and that leads to so much divisiveness, so much jealousy, so much.
So let me briefly summarize for those that can't hear you. So so we're saying that the problem with the metaphor, right, of a man who has more than one wife, then there are favorites, and that's a very good point. But I said the metaphor only goes so far. I also want to clarify: conservative Judaism does not support polygamy. Just, I know. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and so let me say one thing, and then if you want to rebut, and then I'll go with Musaf, but not rebut. I mean rebut in quotation marks. You know what I mean? It is true, right, that there is that sense of if it will give me that sense of superiority, right, over others. In a sense, that is a danger with monotheism in general, right? Because if you believe in monotheism, there's only one God, and you believe that I know things about this God, then it means that I know something that other people don't know, and I'm close. So polytheism is like, I have my truth, I have my God, you have your truth, you have your God. But monotheism is very imperialistic, because it says that this is the God that I believe is the one God. So you can take the Bachar Banu out. I don't think it solves the problem. I think that and that's why we have so many religious conflicts in the world, because when you start to believe in your religious truths in a fundamentalist way, in a way that excludes other ways to the truth, then it gives you that sense of superiority. So it is true that's a problem, but it's a much bigger problem with religion, and I think that that's where it's ultimately a struggle between the fundamentalists and the non-fundamentalists. In the non-fundamentalists' perspective, to always guard against that, to not say that I have a monopoly on the truth. And it doesn't mean everything's relative, because then why should we, but there's a fine line, and it gets complicated.
Maybe we should get onto the Musaf.
Yes. I want to hold the comments, and I want to bring one more example, which is Musaf of change, to example of where conservative Judaism did change, and then we'll do the questions. The reason why I want to cut off is just because I have to leave in 20 minutes to teach a Hebrew high school class. So that's where the schedule, we have blessed with the wonderful problem of having a very busy schedule Sunday mornings at Temple Israel. So there's another example. This is an example of where conservative Judaism did make a change. And very similar to the Reconstructionist change, on Karabanu to Bachrabanu, you change one word. And if someone is saying the Aliyah, if they say it really quickly, you don't even notice. And so this is a similar change. And this change also goes back to 100 years ago. The conservative movement made this change. And it was, and the change is in the Musaf. So, not that Reconstructionists didn't change. The Musaf is not there for a similar reason. So in the Musaf service is the additional service. That's the end of the, in a conservative or Orthodox service. It's after the Torah service, after the ark's put away, you do another Amida at the end. And Musaf means additional, right? And people always say, how come we just did the Amida and Shachari? How come to do it again? I said, well, because you weren't here on time. That's usually my answer. In the Torah, right, the Musaf it's talking about sacrifices. And it says there is a regular sacrifice that's done on the altar every day called the Tamid. But then on festive days, Shabbat, holidays, Rosh Chodesh, you do an extra sacrifice. And that extra sacrifice was a way of making it a special day and marking it. And then what the Musaf Amida is that it references that. It's in lieu of that additional sacrifice. And the traditional Musaf Amida says, we are saying this Amida in lieu of the sacrifices because we were exiled and because we can no longer offer the sacrifices. We pray for the day when the temple will be restored and when we will be able to once again offer the Musaf offering of Shabbat or holiday or whatever holiday it is. Then it mentions the holiday and then it actually gives you the text of 2 bulls and 1 lamb and this and that and the incense and the wine, and it gives you the recipe, the barbecue recipe for the sacrifices on that day. And that's what the Musaf is. So it is a direct reference to the temple. We say in general, when the temple's destroyed and we have synagogue services instead of temple sacrifices, the synagogue service, the Amida, is in lieu of the temple. That's a general sense. In Musaf, it's not even hinted. It's in black and white in the text. That is not the case with the other statutory services, meaning the morning service, the evening service, the afternoon service. Even though mincha means the afternoon offering, but it's only in the name, it's not in the Amida itself. So the change that the conservative movement first made about 100 years, goes back 100 years, is a very, very slight change where they just changed the tense. And instead of saying, we will offer these sacrifices, it says our ancestors offered these sacrifices. It changes it from future tense to past tense. And in the Hebrew, it's very Naaseh v'nakriv, we will do and we will offer. Asu v'krivu, they did and they offered. It's the same roots, it's just the prefix and the suffix changes. Very, very slight. And if the person is, when the cantor, whoever is repeating the Musaf, it's very, very hard to even hear the difference. But that small difference is very significant, right? So it shows that, and it was implemented, I said about 100 years ago, and then preserved in all the subsequent conservative prayer books, as it says, and because that's that is the essence of the unique contribution of conservative Judaism to the different forms of Judaism that we have in modern times, and that focus on history and on the historical experience. To say that it's not that we're praying for return of the sacrifices, we're not. But we don't wipe it out because where we are is a function of our historical memory, and we're bringing forward that historical experience. So we're saying that in ancient times, our ancestors, offered sacrifice in the temple. We are saying these prayers, right? We are saying these prayers in lieu. May you accept these prayers in lieu of the sacrifice. And then it comes together, because the Orthodox prayer book says the same thing, accept our prayers in lieu of the sacrifices. So it kind of gets to the same point, but it's true an historical statement rather than I want something to happen in the future. And that focus on historical, right? It's what one of the original names for conservative Judaism was historical Judaism, because it's focusing on the historical experience. Now, the criticism that conservative Judaism has posed is that, you don't come to synagogue for a history lesson, right? And that prayers are supposed to speak to the heart, not just recount what was done in the past. And that's the challenge that every conservative rabbi needs to respond to that. And and need to, if they they want to follow the sort of the authentic conservative Jewish approach to explain why history is commanding. It's the terms I would use, right? Because we got to combine it with the theological. Why I have that sense of obligation, that covenanted responsibility towards the historical experience that I inherited. But it's because of that rootedness to the past is why the conservative prayer book could not eliminate the Musaf the way that the Reconstructionist and the Reformed prayer books do. Subsequent conservative liturgical offerings have tried to push the envelope a bit more. So the old Silverman prayer book, the Sabbath and Festival prayer book, the actual ingredients of the sacrifice, he put in small print, and in the translation it just said Numbers 28 through to 3 to 5. It was not even translated. So it had everything else with the past tense, and then the actual sacrifice was just in the Hebrew, not translated. Then when that prayer book was sort of supplanted by the Sim Shalom, that was the Jules Harlow prayer book that came out in 1985. The Silverman is between the 20s and the 40s when it was written. So then the 1985 prayer book, he put it in small print, and he said, some congregations omit. And then I'm sorry, wait a second. He said, some congregations add. And then everyone started getting, what do you mean add? You want to take it out. So that was the first printing. The second printing, add, got changed to omit. But in the first printing of Sim Shalom in 1985, it says some congregations add, and then small print of the actual sacrifices. It's the Uviyom Mashabat. If any of you grew up in Shul. It's the text there in the Musaf. The other thing that Rabbi Harlow did is he offered an alternative Musaf that didn't mention sacrifices at all. And so this traditional Musaf, it said he had to then live with some congregations omit instead of add, and it's got the past tense. The alternative Musaf just says stuff about Shabbat without mention to the sacrifices at all. And that was sort of inherited going forward, that there are sort of the more liberal liturgists in the conservative movement are uncomfortable with any mention of the sacrifices. But they don't want to eliminate Musaf, as our Reconstructionists and Reform friends do. Instead, they want to change the Musaf much more radically than the original change, so that there's no reference to the sacrifices whatsoever. And I'm just looking at how it's done here, for example. So you have Musaf, and then, if you want to take a look, it's on 188A, and then you have 188B. And 188B is an alternative, the celebration of Shabbat, with no references to sacrifice. And the whole sacrificial references are all in 188A. Then it does translate the sacrifices, it does give everything, but it is the past tense, so it's still our ancestors offered these sacrifices. But then page B doesn't have it at all. And that way, when you're davening, you have a choice, and it's the same page, 188, and you have a choice of A or B. In the Machzor, there's two different versions, the Musaf. How is that chosen? Oh, you get to choose, right, exactly. So, my theology teacher, was the late Rabbi Neil Neil Gilman at JTS, for whom he was a student of Mordechai Kaplan. So there's like a weird, it's like an opposite circle here, right? Because, and he taught us in school that at seminary that he didn't like the change from 100 years ago to past tense, and that he made a strong argument for using just the traditional language in the future tense. And he said, and his argument was that don't take it literally. It's a metaphor. Of course we don't really want to restore the sacrifices, but if you're talking about the people coming together at the altar in Jerusalem, don't pray about some historical artifact from the past. Pray about our ultimate hopes of being the closest possible way to God, of the Jewish people being united, of the Messianic times. And the words that's used, the restoration of the sacrifices, those are metaphorical. It's a painting, right, of what it would be like at the time of redemption, at the end of days. And we have to have some way of imagining where history is going towards. And if we're using imagery of animal sacrifices, well, that's ancient imagery. And we shouldn't, it doesn't mean that we want to do that. We don't, he said. But we're using that as a poem, right, to sort of help us imagine what we can't actually imagine, because no one can actually describe what redemption is like because we haven't been there, right? So we have to use metaphors the same way we talk about God, that those are metaphors, and those are not to be understood literally. So because of his very sort of radical theology and understanding that all of the language that we use about God is metaphorical, is mythic, then he was able to apply that towards preserving the traditional liturgy. He had a vested interest because he was a Kohen. So, but nevertheless, he made a very strong argument for preserving the traditional text and not changing the tense. So those are, you have from the traditional text, not even using conservative prayer books, to the current conservative prayer books that give you alternatives that don't mention the sacrifices at all, to the sort of standard conservative approach, which is option A, which is you do the sacrifices, but with the change of tense. You can see how there's no single answer, but there's a lot of struggle, right, with what to do with the text there.
Thanks, Rabbi. So one thing that I find really important and interesting that's coming up in this whole conversation that I want to just kind of like emphasize is that there's a question that seems to be in play, right? And this question that's in play is the basic question of, to what extent are we shaped by the language of our liturgy, right? And how are we shaped by the language of our liturgy, right? Because one of the debates that, around whether it's useful to change the language of the liturgy and how to change the language of the liturgy is based on differing assumptions about whether or not reading a text that says XYZ is going to influence the way that we think in particular ways. And if so, how, right? Is reading the Bachar Banus, right, and is internalizing that message through reading it, week after week, day after day, year after year, how is that going to shape our personalities? Or are we naturally going to shape our interpretations of those words through, like, which way does it go? Is it we who shape the text, or is it the text that shapes us? And I think the question of which of those, or to what extent, really plays into these questions very closely of how and when and whether to change the liturgy. And I find that really interesting. I don't have a lot to say about the Musaf because Reconstructionist movement, as Rabbi Fine mentioned, doesn't have it. So all I'll say, the main thing I want to hold up about this that Rabbi Fine hasn't mentioned already is just this, that so part of the Reconstructionist motivations for removing the Musaf have to do with the issues raised by Rabbi Fine regarding the conservative movement's changing of the Musaf Amida text, right? Reconstructionists, by and large, are not big fans of language relating to the rebuilding of the temple, right? That's not a belief or a desire that is held by most Reconstructionist Jews, or I think probably any Reconstructionist Jews. And so, right, the language of the Amidah does not really stand out as, something that is likely to be evocative to the vast majority of Reconstructionist congregants, right? But I think really in practical terms, right, the ultimate reason for the elimination of the Musaf in the Reconstructionist prayer book is very similar to the original reasons for the Reform movement's elimination of the Musaf, and has considerably more to do with reason 3 that I mentioned a while ago, the sort of superfluous nature of the Musaf. I'm being a little harsh when I'm using this language, but I want to kind of express myself as clearly about this as possible. What I'm talking about here is that, rightly or wrongly, the Reconstructionist movement in general has tended to follow the opinion expressed as early as 1844 by Joseph Mayer, who was one of the early proponents of German Reform, that at least one of the reasons for low attendance and engagement in synagogue services has to do with the length and the repetitiveness of the prayers, right? And for that reason, a great deal of early Reform, changes to the liturgy had to do with making prayers more accessible, on the principle that if you made the prayers more accessible, if you made them less repetitious, if you made them less long and involved, people would be more likely to come and fill pews and be involved in services. So what I find useful, really important about, once again, there's a question, there's an underlying set of assumptions and questions there that I think is the thing we really need to focus on, which is there's an ongoing debate and question within progressive Judaism about whether it is in fact true that shorter and more accessible prayers are actually going to result in higher synagogue attendance, and whether longer and less easily accessible prayers are actually a cause for lower synagogue attendance. And the main thing that I want to say about that is, as far as I'm concerned, the jury's still out. Because what we can really observe when we look around at, the broader Jewish world in our present day is that synagogue attendance is down kind of across the board, right? In ways that don't necessarily seem to map easily to the degree to which a given movement has, simplified their siddur, right? You can't necessarily easily point to an uptick in Reform and Reconstructionist attendance that corresponds to a downtick in Orthodox or conservative attendance that might, give some basis for the argument. So that's really what I have to say about that, is that I think a big reason that the Musaf was eliminated in the Reconstructionist movement's siddur has more to do with the desire to make the service more accessible and engaging for folks that maybe don't have the kind of patience that's required to kind of sustain a whole lot of repetition, in the prayer book. But I actually think the jury may still be kind of out as to the actual benefit or efficacy of that. I think also, one thing we need to remember is that a lot of this ultimately, too, comes down to aesthetics, right? And that's a really hard thing to argue, right? There are, I think, folks who find certain aspects of traditional prayers extremely aesthetically pleasing, whether or not they happen to agree in a literal sense with the text of that prayer. You can find it appealing and engaging, right, on an aesthetic level, even if you don't necessarily agree literally with the language of the prayer. And then there are some people who find it extremely unpleasant to be praying, prayers that don't necessarily correspond with something that they believe, right? That's as much, I think, an aesthetic choice as it is a rational or ethical choice. And I think that that's something that maybe we don't even pay enough attention to in the context of what actually drives the different movements to take the different paths that they do, which is the very real impact of aesthetics in the realm of religious expression, right? And the fact that in the modern kind of world, with the liberalization of religious movements, right, where there's more freedom to kind of branch off and found a new movement and do your own thing, that creates a breadth of opportunities for people with different kinds of religious aesthetics that animate their own soul to kind of find an environment that really suits them. Some people find some environments to be aesthetically and spiritually uplifting, and some people find other environments to be much more, their cup of tea. And I think that what's interesting about the life of Jews in the modern world is precisely that the range of options gives a certain free range for exploring Jewish aesthetics in a way that I think Jews in past times maybe didn't have as much of an access to because of the ways in which those things tended to be more heavily determined by where you lived than by any personal choice that an individual worshiper might have had. Yeah, do we want to?
Just add one word, because I have to leave in a second. So there are pragmatic reasons, of course, for cutting liturgy. There's also ideological reasons, and there's never mutually exclusive. So a big reason why the Reform movement removed the Musaf, which brings us full circle to Bob's introduction, is because of Israel. This was a time before Zionism, and a time when Jewish civil rights were at play, right? Whether Jews could be given equal citizenship rights to other people. So the Reform movement wanted to make the point that we are not a foreign nation in exile on foreign soil, which is essentially what the Musaf says. We were exiled from our land, want to come back and do the sacrifices. Rather, we belong here. So that was, it's also why they called it a temple, not a synagogue, or, which we, even a temple Israel, inherited, right? So, and there's that play as well, right? So however you rephrase the Musaf is still, it's not about Zionism, it is about Jerusalem, and it has that's a sense of holy space that is referenced there, and whether that's, you address that as an essential element of prayer. The last thing also I just want to say on the Musaf is that I have a lot more respect for Reform and Reconstructionist Liturgy that cut it out than for page 188b in the conservative prayer book, right? Because my problem with 188b is if you don't like the Musaf, then just don't say it, right? So there's a phrase in Hebrew that's called, that always makes me think of, it's called ha'ikar chaser min ha'sefer, which means the essence is missing from the book. Right? The book's got a cut. It's the opposite of don't judge a book by a cover. It's like a book got a nice cover, but doesn't have any words on the inside. So the whole point of Musaf is the reference to the sacrifices. And if you're not going to say something about that, then why do Musaf? Then you cut it out, which is what Reform and Reconstructionists do, which is a reasonable, rational approach. So that's why I think, which brings me back to the benefit of these type of conversations, right? To be able to understand the different perspectives, and it's a rare opportunity. So I want to thank Rabbi Moser also for doing this. And when we do our adult ed, let's also we have to start sharply at 9:30, okay? Because of the time, because of the hour that we're in. And I will forgive me for not hanging around for questions, but I have my high schoolers waiting upstairs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Fine and Rabbi Moser. A very terrific discussion. I'm sure much appreciated. If Rabbi Moser doesn't mind, take a couple of questions.
I'm fine to hang around for a couple of
Okay, David.
I have a wonder about the difference between a religion and a social club. Could we just say whatever we want to say, or how are we connected to, say, the original text? And I guess that one of the differences that we're talking about today is, the Bible is unchanging. I didn't hear anything about the Reconstruction, the Reform, or the Orthodox changing the Torah. It's just changing the prayers that we say in shul. It's just a continual, what are we here for?
All right, so that's a complex question with many threads, so I'll try to pick out a couple of threads and maybe respond. And I hope I'm responding to the spirit of the question. So the first question that you asked was the difference between a religion and a social club. And I think that is a really interesting question to ask, because we feel intuitively that there is a difference there, right? And then the question is, what actually makes that difference? Part of the implication, I think, of your question is that part of what makes it a religion for you, maybe, instead of a social club, is its connection to, like, ancient text, right? That there's a historical continuity that maybe makes it feel more like a religion. I think that's a really valid approach. I think that there's maybe another perspective, too, that I think is that we could examine, that you could say that what makes it a religion and not a social club is that a social club, you're ultimately there to be in community with other people that you're connected with, right? And what you're doing during that time, I mean, as long as you're not totally hating it, right, is kind of immaterial, right? It doesn't matter what we're doing. Like, we could be playing Pinochle, we could be playing Dungeons and Dragons, we could be playing basketball. It doesn't matter. It's a social club. You know, I'm there to hang out with my friends. But that what makes it a religion is my attachment to the thing is our attachment to the thing that we're doing, and the sense that what we are doing together here is reflecting and manifesting our sense of attachment to what we regard as ultimate truth, right? Or the absolute kind of core of our lives, right? And that from that perspective, right, what makes it a religion and not a social club is that it's alive and that it's deeply relevant to us. And if we take that as our basis for understanding it as this is what makes it a religion and not a social club, then I would argue that that's actually an argument in favor of adjusting the content of the religion as we go along, right? Because the minute that you drop that connection to the living, beating heart of what it is that you actually believe, and find that you are in a space and you are praying in ways that don't really speak to your heart, right? However they might come to speak, those words might come to speak to your heart, then at that point you're maybe taking a dangerous step away from religion and into the realm of social club. I say that, I want to make clear, without any judgment or comment about what it is actually, right, what form that might take that actually does in fact speak to a community's heart, right? Because I think it's absolutely the case that different religious communities, even different communities within the same, like, putative religious kind of, you know, like umbrella, right, may have a different sense about what actually lies at the beating heart of their faith, of their connection to the divine, of their connection to the truth. But I think that, like, ultimately where I have to come down is that what makes it a religion and not a social club is that the people who are there not simply because they enjoy being part of it, because it's something to do on a Saturday, as it were, right? But because it's really speaking to them and their deep-set needs, right, of their heart. And I think that ultimately, whatever liturgy we're praying, and whatever form that our prayers are, whatever form our practice is taking, like, that has to ultimately be the core of what we're doing, is that it's manifesting something deep and true and alive for us. And that if we ever find that we're losing track of that, then something may have been gone kind of off track and that we need to rediscover that. Whether that means going back to some kind of earlier manifestation of our tradition and finding our roots, or whether that means taking something that we're doing now and transforming it to better reflect what we actually believe and feel. But if we ever feel like we're getting so disconnected that we don't really feel like this is, you know, reflective of our deepest values, then maybe there's something going on there that we need to reassess and examine and find a way to bring it back from that social club place and into the religion place. I don't know. It's a hard question.
Any other questions that you'd like to share? Craig?
Very interesting, Rabbi. So you had talked, I think, about supernatural versus divine presence as an understanding of God unique to Reconstruction Judaism. And I think I understand what you're saying, and I know sometimes I struggle because conservative Judaism, the prayers sometimes sound anachronistic, and sometimes you think, gee, some of these prayers might have been written before a lot of modern science, et cetera, et cetera. So I think your comment is somewhat of a response to that. I'm sure conservative Judaism also responds to that, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you were alluding to.
Yeah, so one of the key motivators of the early generation of the early phase of Reconstructionism, and I keep qualifying early versus late Reconstructionism because the movement is a movement which is devoted to change and adjustment as a sort of doctrinal principle is not always going to remain exactly the same, right? It's going to generationally shift as different generations come along and their needs end up being, spiritual needs end up being different maybe in some ways from previous generations. So the early Reconstructionists, of whom Kaplan was sort of the sort of founding figure, a lot of the other Reconstructionist rabbis sort of like coalesced around him and some of the ideas that he was expressing. One of the real key problems that they saw in contemporary Judaism, and I'm talking here about Judaism of their time, which is like the 1920s and 30s when this started out, was that there were people of tremendous intellectual caliber, very smart with it people, who were leaving Judaism because they could not get behind what they saw as the outmoded theology of the prayers, right? For Kaplan in particular, the big example of this was Felix Adler. Felix Adler was born Jewish. He was an extremely gifted intellectual. He ends up walking away from Judaism because he sees the theology is outmoded and founds the Society for Ethical Culture. Right? Kaplan saw this, and Kaplan felt some things about that fact because he felt like Judaism in his day could ill afford to lose people like Felix Adler. And so part of that, and partially too because Kaplan and a lot of his fellow like early Reconstructionist rabbis happened to agree with Adler that the theology was outmoded, right? Wanted to find a different way to express Jewish theology that would be more in keeping with the rationalism and focus on scientific forms of knowledge that were more characteristic of the modern era that they were living in, right? And part of that, for them, involved a clear-cut rejection of supernaturalism, of the idea of miracles as they appear in the Bible, of the idea of a personal God who, like, as depicted in the Bible sometimes, right, like, you know, says things and takes actions in the way that a person would that gets angry or sad, right? And instead try to construct what they saw as a naturalist conception of God. And that conception of God for them ended up being formulated in that sort of classic Reconstructionist formulation that God is the power in the universe that makes for salvation. In other words, that God is not a thing, God is a quality, an attribute that we can perceive in all sorts of things in the universe around us. God is the thing in all things that drives them toward the good and that keeps them from falling into like darkness and sickness and badness, right? That's a conception of the divine that is much more of God that is much more concerned with the godliness that is in us and that motivates us to try to be better people, and is a lot less concerned with the idea of God in the mode that we might envision God as like a king sitting on a throne or a father protecting his children, right? And the early Reconstructionists put a lot of effort into reworking at least some of the prayers to better reflect that more sort of naturalist, the term that sometimes gets thrown around is panentheist idea of God, the idea of God in nature, not God above nature, right? A lot of contemporary Reconstructionists still adhere to that sort of very naturalist, panentheist, Kaplanian conception of God. I'd say that in the modern day, though, there's considerably more breadth of scope in terms of the different kinds of theologies that contemporary Reconstructionist rabbis tend to espouse. I think part of that change has to do with the general rediscovery of traditionalist Judaism by liberal Jews in the 1960s, a sort of return to a new traditionalism that was really kind of flourishing in the American Jewish community in the 1960s and 70s and gave rise to, for example, publications like the Jewish Catalog, right? That kind of thing. But I think also part of it is reflective of the flowering in the mid to late 20th century of postmodernism, right? An approach that sort of sees itself as sort of post-modern rationalism, right? That understands the contents of texts and truth claims to be ultimately more relative and less absolute than the modernists were claiming that they were, right? And that there are quite a few contemporary Reconstructionist rabbis who end up embracing theologies that appear on the surface at least to be somewhat more traditionalist or mystical than the sort of hyper-rationalist modernism of Kaplan, right? Without at the same time embracing the aspects of those theologies that would drive one toward being religiously fundamentalist, right? While maintaining a set of values commitments to liberalism and progressivism and democracy. The fact that some Reconstructionist rabbis of the present day are able to do that is, I think, highly reflective of the postmodern turn of thought that started happening especially in the late 70s and 80s and has only sort of continued to kind of entrench itself as part of our thinking, and that's maybe led to a certain kind of rediscovery of the quality of the mystical in religion, even among people who aren't necessarily religious fundamentalists. That said, there's still a very strong element of that strong kind of Kaplanian naturalist theology that's present in the Reconstructionist movement, and it's one that a lot of Reconstructionists, rabbis would uphold as part of their theology, and it's also one, incidentally, that has had a tremendous influence outside the Reconstructionist movement. As Rabbi Fine has mentioned numerous times, that kind of Kaplanian theology has played an important role in the religious thinking and the theology of a great many conservative rabbis, right? Thus illustrating yet again that the divisions between movements within progressive Judaism at least are sometimes a little bit artificial, right? That there maybe exists a real denominational boundary that we can point to that exists between progressive and Orthodox Judaism, but within progressive Judaism at least, there's a lot of cross-pollination that goes on and that continues going on because in the end, contemporary Jews of our time tend to choose movements and synagogues based on what I'm characterizing here as aesthetic reasons, right? Or social or ethical reasons more than on matters of theology, which actually are usually much more flexible and fluid for most people than you would think just looking at the official platforms of the different movements.
Rabbi Moser, thank you. We don't take your whole day. I appreciate everyone being here today. Next week, Sunday, 9:30, Adult Education continues with the Rabbi Fine tells you about his interesting investigation of ancient Jewish texts held by the Vatican. Please join us for that next time.
Oh, yeah, let me just... Yeah, I'll just do a quick plug for this. Thanks. Okay, so before you go, I'm going to do a quick plug for my Tuesday evening class. We've started it up just 4 weeks ago. It's been going on pretty great since then. What we're calling it is the Who's Who. But what we really mean by that is every single week we're looking at a particular key figure from the history of Jewish thought. At least at this particular moment, we've been looking at a lot of rabbis from the Tannaitic period, the period of the Mishnah. So it's like each week we take a whole hour and do a deep dive into the life and significance and historical context of a particular figure. I would say particular rabbi, but I'm not holding myself to that. We might do philosophers and other Jewish thinkers later on once we get to the point where that is a meaningful distinction. But it's been a really cool class, really engaged, a lot of people asking great questions. Each one is very self-contained because we're looking at one particular person. I highly encourage people to, it's on Zoom, I highly encourage people to attend if they're able. If you want to attend, what you need to do is you need to send me, Rabbi Leiah, an email, and I will put you on the mailing list and you will receive the link to the class. That's the best way to do it because we do a different Zoom link every week to prevent weirdos getting on the Zoom links, right? So if you're interested at all, I'm Rabbi Leiah at synagogue.org. Send me an email. I'll put you on the list. Also, if you have not been attending the classes so far, that's okay because we are trying something a little new this year and we are recording every class and uploading it onto YouTube. I'm recording it, don't worry, in a way that nobody's video gets up on the YouTube. It's just me, right? But that does mean that you can go back, you can ask for the link, I'll send it to you, you can go back and you can look through, at this point, 4 one-hour classes about that like, you know, and kind of catch up if you want to do that. The first class in particular is really useful, I think, to go check out, specifically because the entire class, we didn't look at a particular figure, we looked at the different periods of rabbinic history and what the terms like Tanaim and Amoraim and Geonim, what those terms mean and what historical period this was and the significance of that generation or generations of rabbis and Jewish thinkers. So highly encourage people to come on the Zoom if they can. If you want to come, send me an email. I will get you on the list. We will get you set up.